the core absurdity. History is often treated like a record of what mattered, but in reality, it's a record of what we decided we could live with remembering. So why do certain laws quietly disappear from textbooks? Why do entire policies vanish without explanation? Why were some ideas once taught as fact only to be erased as if they never existed? These things weren't removed because they were insignificant. They were removed because they became embarrassing, awkward, impossible to defend out loud. Tonight isn't about secrets or conspiracies. It's about 50 moments in history that were quietly edited out, not because they were false, but because they were too dumb to keep explaining. And once you see the pattern, the gaps start to make sense. 1. In the early 1900s, American medical textbooks promoted rest cures for women diagnosed with hysteria, prescribing isolation and forced inactivity. The treatment was taught as legitimate therapy. By the mid-20th century, the diagnosis was removed as unscientific and sexist. The practice wasn't formally disavowed. It simply stopped appearing in curricula, replaced without explanation. 2. In the late 19th century, U.S. schools taught phrenology as a scientific method to measure intelligence and character by skull shape. Universities offered courses and exams on it. As genetics and neuroscience advanced, phrenology was discredited. Textbooks quietly dropped the charts and terminology, rarely acknowledging how widely it had once been accepted. 3. During the early 20th century, American public schools taught eugenics as modern science, including lessons on selective breeding and undesirable traits. State governments funded programs based on these ideas. After World War II, references to eugenics were rapidly removed from textbooks. The material vanished without a clear reckoning for its role in policy. 4. In the 1950s, U.S. civil defense manuals instructed schoolchildren to survive nuclear explosions by ducking and covering under desks. The guidance was printed, broadcast, and drilled nationwide. As nuclear strategy evolved, the advice was recognized as ineffective. It disappeared from textbooks, replaced by silence rather than correction. 5. Throughout the early 20th century, American history books framed indigenous boarding schools as benevolent educational efforts. Abuse and forced assimilation were omitted. By the late 20th century, the language softened further, and many textbooks removed detailed references entirely. The institutions weren't erased, the harm was. 6. In the early 1900s, medical texts recommended cigarette smoking to treat asthma and respiratory issues. Tobacco companies sponsored studies cited in educational materials. As evidence of harm became undeniable, these recommendations vanished from medical training. The endorsements were removed without formal acknowledgement of how official they once were. 7. In the mid-20th century, American textbooks taught lobotomy as a breakthrough psychiatric treatment. Hospitals performed tens of thousands of procedures. By the 1970s, the practice was largely abandoned. References in educational materials faded quietly, often reduced to brief mentions without context. 8. During the Cold War, U.S. school curricula portrayed leaded gasoline as a technological success, emphasizing efficiency and progress. Health impacts were minimized or excluded. When environmental research proved widespread harm, textbooks updated chemical facts but avoided discussing decades of endorsement. The celebration disappeared. Responsibility did not replace it. 9. In the early 1900s, public health manuals taught that alcoholism was a moral defect rather than a medical condition. Educational materials promoted discipline over treatment. As psychology advanced, the framing shifted. The moral language was removed from textbooks without addressing its influence on law and punishment. 10. In the 1960s, some U.S. sex education materials claimed pregnancy could not occur under specific circumstances, now known to be false. These claims appeared in state-approved curricula. As medical understanding improved, the statements were eliminated. The correction came through omission, not revision. 11. In the early 20th century, U.S. home economics textbooks taught that women's higher education reduced fertility and harmed family stability. Universities circulated the claim in guidance materials. As demographic data contradicted it, the argument disappeared from curricula. The idea wasn't corrected in print, it simply stopped being taught. 12. During the 1910s to 1930s, American public health courses promoted racial hygiene language borrowed from European science. State institutions referenced it in training materials. After World War II, the terminology vanished from textbooks. The policy implications were not revisited. The vocabulary was removed. 13. In the mid-20th century, U.S. geography textbooks described certain regions as biologically suited to specific races. The framing appeared in state-approved materials. As civil rights standards changed, the language was dropped. Later editions omitted the passages without noting the prior claims. 14. Early 1900s nutrition guides used in American schools warned against tomatoes as toxic due to acidity. The claim appeared in household manuals and lessons. As food science advanced, the warning disappeared. The retraction came by omission, not explanation. 15. In the 1940s to 1950s, U.S. psychology courses taught homosexuality as a diagnosable disorder. Medical associations endorsed the classification. When professional standards changed in the 1970s, the diagnosis was removed. Textbooks updated categories while minimizing discussion of the earlier framing. 16. Mid-20th century American textbooks framed child labor as a temporary necessity of industrial growth. Ethical objections were minimized. As labor laws strengthened, the framing shifted. Detailed justifications were removed, leaving brief historical mentions without the original rationale. 17. In the 1950s, U.S. civil defense curricula instructed communities to build backyard fallout shelters as a viable survival strategy. Government pamphlets and lessons promoted the practice. As feasibility was questioned, references dwindled. The guidance faded without formal reversal. Early 20th century anthropology texts in the U.S. ranked cultures on linear civilization scales. Universities taught the model. As the discipline evolved, the scales were abandoned. Textbooks removed the charts, rarely addressing how foundational they once were. In the 1960s, some American driver education materials minimized seatbelt effectiveness, suggesting skill mattered more. As safety data accumulated, the guidance changed. The earlier skepticism was removed from lessons without acknowledging its prevalence. Late 19th century U.S. civics books framed voting restrictions as safeguards of competence. The rationale was taught openly. As democratic standards expanded, the explanations were excised. Later texts referenced reforms without reproducing the original arguments. Looking back at the first 20 examples, a pattern becomes hard to ignore. None of these ideas were hidden. They weren't fringe beliefs or underground theories. They were taught openly, printed in textbooks, endorsed by institutions that defined what normal meant at the time. What changed wasn't just evidence, it was tolerance. At some point, explaining these ideas became harder than removing them. So instead of rewriting the story, the system shortened it. Language softened. Details vanished. Entire explanations were replaced with absence. What's striking isn't how wrong these ideas were, it's how long they remained acceptable, and how quietly they disappeared afterward. History didn't argue with them. It stepped around them. And once something stops being mentioned, it doesn't feel erased. It just feels like it was never there. In the early 20th century, U.S. medical schools taught that left-handedness was a defect linked to mental instability. Educational materials encouraged correction in children. As psychology advanced, the claim was abandoned. Textbooks removed the guidance without addressing how widely it had been enforced in classrooms. During the 1930s, American economics textbooks promoted austerity during economic downturns as a moral necessity. The advice appeared in university curricula. As Keynesian theory gained influence after World War II, the moral framing disappeared. Later editions revised models without revisiting the earlier prescriptions. In mid-20th century U.S. biology textbooks, women were described as biologically less suited for leadership due to emotional variability. The claim appeared in educational explanations of sex differences. As research standards changed, the passages were removed. The textbooks updated conclusions without acknowledging the former assertions. 24. Early American geography lessons taught that tropical climates produced laziness and underdevelopment. The framing appeared in school-approved materials. As post-war scholarship rejected environmental determinism, the language vanished. Revised textbooks omitted the theory rather than explaining its influence. 25. In the 1950s, U.S. driver safety manuals suggested that skilled drivers did not require seatbelts. State education programs distributed the guidance. When accident data contradicted it, the recommendation was removed. The earlier advice disappeared without correction. 26. In early 20th century American civics courses, imperial expansion was framed as a civilizing duty. The language appeared in textbooks and lectures. As global attitudes shifted after decolonization, the framing was dropped. Later editions referenced events without reproducing the justification. 27. In the 1960s, U.S. psychology textbooks described autism as caused by emotionally distant parenting. Universities taught the theory as mainstream. As neuroscience advanced, the explanation was abandoned. Textbooks replaced the theory without addressing its prior impact on families. 28. Mid-20th century American home safety manuals taught that lead-based paint posed minimal risk if undisturbed. The guidance appeared in public education materials. When health data proved otherwise, the reassurance vanished. The recommendation was removed without revisiting earlier endorsements. 29. In early American sex education curricula, menstruation was described as a condition requiring secrecy and restriction. Schools taught behavioral guidelines rather than biology. As health education evolved, the language was removed. The framing disappeared without acknowledgement. 30. In the 1940s to 1950s, U.S. military training materials framed psychological trauma as a sign of weakness. The guidance influenced civilian education. As PTSD became recognized, the framing was abandoned. Textbooks updated terminology while minimizing the earlier dismissal. In the early 1900s, American public schools taught that children should be physically punished to correct moral weakness. Corporal punishment was endorsed in teacher manuals. As educational psychology shifted, the guidance was removed. Textbooks stopped justifying the practice without confronting how normalized it once was. During the 1920s to 1940s, U.S. textbooks described segregation as a natural social order rather than a political choice. The framing appeared in civics education. As civil rights legislation passed, the explanations were removed. Later materials referenced integration without reproducing the earlier logic. In mid-20th century American biology classes, homosexuality was described as a developmental failure linked to improper socialization. Universities taught the claim as science. When classifications changed, the passages disappeared. The revision removed the theory without documenting its role in education. In the early Cold War era, U.S. textbooks framed nuclear superiority as a stabilizing force that ensured peace. The argument appeared in government-backed curricula. As arms control thinking developed, the framing was softened. The confidence in escalation quietly vanished from lessons. Early 20th century American economics courses taught child poverty as a result of parental moral failure. The explanation appeared in university texts. As structural analysis gained traction, the framing was removed. Later editions revised causes without acknowledging the earlier attribution. In the 1950s, U.S. school materials taught that women should avoid certain professions due to psychological fragility under stress. Career guidance documents circulated nationally. As workforce norms changed, the recommendations disappeared. Textbooks updated options without addressing prior restrictions. 37. Mid-century American health education warned that masturbation caused physical weakness and mental decline. The claim appeared in school-approved pamphlets. As medical standards evolved, the warnings were dropped. The shift occurred through removal, not correction. 38. In the early 20th century, American anthropology texts classified cultures as advanced or primitive, using evolutionary hierarchies. Universities taught the framework. As the discipline rejected the model, the charts were removed. The foundational role of the hierarchy went largely unaddressed. 39. During the 1940s, U.S. government publications taught that food rationing would permanently improve national discipline. The claim appeared in civilian education. After the war, the idea disappeared. Textbooks omitted the prediction rather than reflecting on its assumptions. 40. In the mid-20th century, American textbooks framed mental illness primarily as a moral or personal failing. Educational materials reinforced stigma. As psychiatric models evolved, the language was removed. The earlier framing faded without direct acknowledgement. By this point, the mechanism is no longer subtle. These ideas weren't removed because they were obscure or short-lived. They were taught long enough to shape behavior, policy, and expectation. What disappeared wasn't just content, it was accountability. When standards changed, the system didn't pause to explain itself. It adjusted vocabulary, trimmed context, and moved forward as if the earlier certainty had never existed. What's consistent across decades isn't ignorance, but confidence. Each idea entered textbooks as common sense. Each left without a formal goodbye. History didn't revise the argument. It revised the silence around it. And once silence sets in, responsibility becomes optional. The past feels smaller, cleaner, easier to manage, not because it improved, but because fewer people are asked to remember how it was justified. In the early 20th century, U.S. school hygiene courses taught that poor sanitation was primarily a result of individual laziness. Municipal responsibility was minimized. As public health infrastructure expanded, the framing was removed. Later textbooks focused on systems without acknowledging the earlier blame placed on individuals. During the 1950s, American education materials framed juvenile delinquency as a product of comic books and popular music. The claim appeared in school guidance and parent manuals. As research failed to support it, references disappeared. The fear was removed without revisiting how widely it was promoted. In mid-20th century U.S. economics classes, inflation was taught as a simple moral failure of spending discipline. The explanation appeared in introductory texts. As monetary theory advanced, the framing vanished. Textbooks updated models without confronting the earlier moral narrative. Early American psychology courses taught intelligence as a fixed, hereditary trait measurable by a single score. The approach was presented as definitive. As research challenged the model, textbooks removed the certainty. The shift occurred quietly, without addressing decades of educational sorting based on it. In the early Cold War period, U.S. textbooks described mass surveillance as a temporary necessity rather than a long-term policy choice. The framing appeared in civics education. As norms changed, the language softened and then disappeared. The earlier justification was not revisited. 46. In mid-20th century American health classes, obesity was framed solely as a personal failure of willpower. Structural factors were excluded. As medical understanding evolved, the framing was removed. The disappearance came without acknowledgement of how deeply it shaped stigma. 47. Early 20th century U.S. textbooks described disability primarily as a burden requiring segregation. Educational materials promoted separation as humane. As inclusion models emerged, the language vanished. The rationale was removed without examining its long-standing effects. 48. In the 1940s to 1950s, American civics lessons taught that voter apathy was preferable to uninformed participation. The idea appeared in instructional texts. As democratic engagement became emphasized, the argument was dropped. Later editions omitted the position entirely. 49. Mid-century American Family Studies courses framed domestic violence as a private matter outside public intervention. The stance appeared in educational materials. As legal standards changed, the framing was removed. Textbooks updated policy references without revisiting the earlier silence. In the early 20th century, U.S. education materials treated environmental damage as an unavoidable cost of progress. The framing appeared in industrial studies. As environmental science gained prominence, the language disappeared. The acceptance was removed without acknowledging how normalized it once was. At this point, the pattern is complete. Across different decades and disciplines, the response is the same. When an idea stops being defensible, it isn't debated in public. It isn't revisited with care. It's removed from the story. The system doesn't say, "We were wrong." It shortens the explanation until it disappears. What remains isn't accuracy, it's continuity. Textbooks move forward, language updates, context thins out. And over time, what was once taught as normal starts to feel unthinkable. Not because it never existed, but because remembering it would require admitting how confidently it was defended. History doesn't forget these things. It just stops pointing at them, which makes the past easier to manage and responsibility easier to avoid. Looking back, none of these ideas disappeared because time erased them. They disappeared because explaining them became harder than removing them. History didn't correct itself in these moments. It edited itself. What was once taught with confidence didn't collapse under debate. It faded through omission, a quieter, cleaner exit that required no apology. Across science, policy, education, and culture, the same response repeats. When an idea becomes too embarrassing to defend, the system doesn't confront it. It simplifies the narrative and moves on. Textbooks change tone. Curricula adjust language. And what once shaped decisions is reduced to a footnote, or nothing at all. This doesn't mean history is false. It means it's selective, not in favor of truth, but in favor of coherence, of stories that are easier to teach, easier to remember, and easier to live with. Most people will never notice what's missing, because absence doesn't feel like erasure. It just feels normal. And that's the most effective part of the process. The past doesn't need to be hidden to lose its weight. It only needs to stop being pointed at. Once that happens, mistakes don't disappear. They just become easier to repeat.